opening lines, claiming central territory and freeing the queen and bishop, instantly contesting the center's central influence. This Sicilian defense prepares a robust counterplay on the queenside. Developing a knight to a natural central square prepares for rapid kingside castling and pressures the pawn structure. By advancing the e-pawn, Black prepares to develop the king's bishop, but it does constrict the queen's mobility for the moment. Opening the center decisively claims space and prepares a fierce pawn storm. Opening the center, Black surrenders central pawns to gain time for development and pressure against White's advanced king. Puncturing the pawn chain with the knight immediately opens crucial diagonals. A bold bid for central influence. Developing the knight efficiently addresses the central pawn and prepares for castling, harmonizing the piece with the emerging position. Asserting central influence. This knight solidifies White's pawn structure and prepares rapid development. Solidifying the pawn center and preparing development. This pawn push embraces a more closed structure for Black. Developing the bishop to e3 now subtly prepares for kingside castling. Aiming to untangle White's pieces and activate the monarch's safety while simultaneously eyeing the queenside if an opportunity arises. This pawn advance subtly prepares to control the b5 square, preventing White's knight or bishop from finding an easy outpost there. It's a move that prioritizes positional soundness over immediate tactical fireworks, aiming to solidify Black's pawn structure and gradually build pressure along the queenside. Solidifying the center and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm. This advance also subtly limits Black's knight development and aims to control more of the board, though it does create a slight backwardness on the e3-f3 diagonal. Expanding on the queenside, this pawn thrust aims to seize crucial queenside space, potentially unbalancing White's central grip and opening avenues for piece activity. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside with g4 aims to aggressively exploit the space Black conceded on the queenside, potentially trapping Black's light-squared bishop and creating weaknesses around the White king. Though it also opens lines for counterplay and demands precise follow-up to avoid overextending. Preventing White's relentless kingside pawn storm. This quiet defensive maneuver aims to create a crucial buffer zone, safeguarding the king's sanctuary and potentially creating an escape route via the g-file should circumstances demand. Securing the queen's escape route from the advancing kingside pawns and preparing for a potential queenside pawn storm against Black's somewhat cramped position. Bringing the bishop to b7 establishes a crucial diagonal for the queenside counterplay, aiming to pressure White's central pawn structure and prepare for a potential pawn storm on the kingside. Unleashing the king's side of the board. This maneuver shoves the rook towards the queenside, immediately creating imbalances and daring Black to commit their pieces. A bold declaration of aggressive intent in this Sicilian structure. This is a dynamic choice, forcing White's king further into the open and immediately seeking to exploit the d4 pawns. Isolation with potential queen and knight interplay on the queenside. Securing the king from potential discovery attacks along the newly opened diagonal is paramount. A prudent step before delving deeper into the tactical complexities unfolding on the queenside. A bold thrust. 11. b4. Immediately challenges White's central pawn structure and seeks to disrupt the queenside coordination, aiming to create complications and gain vital space before the opponent can fully consolidate. This knight's journey to e2, though seemingly a retreat, aims to bolster the queenside defense and prepare for a potential kingside expansion, creating a dynamic tension where White's king's safety is momentarily secondary to central control and counterplay. A developing piece. The knight hops to d7, shoring up its central presence and preparing for potential advances on the queenside or a possible maneuver to c5, unleashing a pawn storm against black's kingside. This aggressive pawn thrust aims to pry open the h-file and exploit the now exposed black king, creating immediate attacking chances before black can adequately organize their queenside. Counterplay. Shifting the knight to e5 introduces a dangerous outpost, directly challenging white's central control and creating potential threats towards the f3 pawn and beyond, while also preparing to support a d5 pawn push. Unleashing the knight to g3 signals a deliberate redirection, aiming to bolster the kingside assault by preparing for g4 gram5 and potentially anchoring the knight for a future jump into f5, thereby increasing pressure on black's central structure and pawn chain. The doubled pawns on the queenside are a clear target, and concentrating forces towards the open c-file now becomes a priority, potentially pressuring the white king's safety as well. Pushing the pawn to g5 aggressively carves out more kingside space, aiming to further suffocate black's queenside counterplay and prepare an assault. The pawn grab *hx g5 ** voluntarily opens the h-file for white's attacking forces, potentially exposing your king to a direct assault. While it removes a pawn that was hindering white's kingside advance, it comes at a significant positional cost, sacrificing tactical control for immediate material gain. This decision invites a sharp response, where vigilance against discovered attacks and rapid counterplay will be paramount. Consider how this open file might be exploited, and be prepared to reinforce your monarch's safety through proactive piece placement and defensive structures. The pawn push opens the h-file, directly threatening the newly arrived knight on g5 and creating immediate complications for black's king. White aims to exploit the exposed nature of the black monarchy, transforming the queenside tension into a direct kingside assault. Observe how this action forces black into a reactive stance, potentially disrupting their queenside expansion plans as they must now address the urgent kingside danger. The sacrifice of the rook opens up the h-file with a vengeance, fundamentally altering the character of the position and forcing white's king into a precarious situation. Reclaiming the knight opens up the h-file for white's rook, creating immediate pressure on black's castled king. This aggressive pawn thrust by white, culminating in the capture, forces black to confront the exposed position of their monarch and the potential for a swift attack. A bold foray into the white king's immediate vicinity. This pawn thrust immediately throws the spotlight onto the monarch's compromised safety, creating a direct tactical confrontation that bypasses further positional maneuvering. Seizing the open h-file with the knight offers a temporary respite from black's persistent queenside pressure, but it fundamentally neglects the critical central struggle, potentially leaving white's king exposed to future tactical incursions. Black's knight plunges into the heart of white's camp, seeking to disrupt the precarious pawn chain and exploit the slight disorganization of white's pieces after the pawn exchange. This aggressive foray creates immediate tactical possibilities, forcing white to react precisely to avoid material loss or a compromised position. The knight's new outpost on e4 exerts significant pressure along the d-file and eyes the f2 square, potentially creating threats against the king if white is not careful. Consider the consequences of any potential pawn pushes by white. They might open lines for black's active pieces or conversely, create weaknesses that can be exploited, instantly redirecting the queen to a more active square. This maneuver aims to bolster the e4 pawn's defense while preparing for potential counterplay on the kingside, exploiting the weakened dark squares around black's monarch that have emerged from the exchange. Embracing the open files by fortifying the kingside with a pawn push often invites counterplay on the opposite flank, which is precisely what black is attempting here by consolidating his central pawns and preparing for further queenside expansion. Seizing the initiative, white reclaims central influence and prepares to develop their queen to a more active square, potentially eyeing the b6 pawn and bolstering the kingside defense simultaneously. The black bishop, now free from its pawn confinement, activates wonderfully, eyeing the king's flank and reinforcing the e4 square, while also preparing to participate in the queenside play, harnessing the bishop's diagonal pressure on the queenside king's flank. This maneuver aims to exploit the recent exchange on the kingside and bolster white's central control, potentially preparing a pawn advance like c3 to solidify pawn structure and create a more cohesive central presence. Shifting the queen aggressively to the center aims to disrupt white's kingside buildup and exploit the slight disorganization after the rook exchange, creating potential tactical skirmishes. Recognizing the dangerous potential of black's queen and bishop battery on the a5-e1 diagonal, white prioritizes neutralizing this threat by repositioning the bishop to a more defensive square, simultaneously reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn advances on the kingside. A well-timed knight fork, exploiting the pinned queen and opening lines for potential attacks. Sacrificing the king's safety for a queenside pawn structure that might become isolated is a bold gamble, accepting a material deficit to potentially disrupt black's coordination and open lines. Black's queen triumphantly reclaims her position, initiating a decisive shift in material balance. This recapture, seemingly straightforward, fundamentally alters the game's trajectory by forcing a liquidation of white's attacking pawns and exposing the white king to increased pressure on the open files. The material advantage now heavily favors black, giving them a significant edge in the ensuing positional struggle. Seizing the open file on the e-file solidifies white's control and prepares for endgame advantages. As the dust settles from the exchanges, the immediate capture of white's bishop significantly alters the endgame balance, creating a somewhat simplified position where black has regained material equality but needs to be mindful of the potential for white's remaining pieces to become active. Reclaiming the pawn opens a vital file, offering a new pathway for the rook to become active and potentially target the now slightly exposed black king. The black bishop, now on e4, aggressively stakes its claim in the center, eyeing the open lines that have begun to emerge from the recent exchanges, while simultaneously daring white's queen to relocate to a more vulnerable square. Unlocking the b-file for potential future queenside expansion hinges on this knight's redeployment. Consider how this rerouting prepares for aggressive central breaks or a swift swing to the kingside. If the opportunity arises, black boldly exchanges the bishop, accepting a structurally compromised pawn center in exchange for active piece play and the removal of white's well-placed bishop from the queenside diagonal. Securing a passed pawn on the queenside by capturing the pawn on e6 immediately reconfigures the board, aiming to exploit black's somewhat exposed king and potentially simplify into a favorable endgame, where the extra pawn could become decisive. The absorption of the knight opens a critical diagonal for white's queen, transforming the previously passive bishop into a fearsome attacker. Repositioning the rook to the open file finally claims control of the critical pathway, creating immediate pressure against black's isolated pawn. The rook's relocation to the fourth rank activates it on an open file, aiming to exert pressure on white's potentially vulnerable king and control the center of the board. Asserting dominion over the queenside opens up a crucial avenue for development. The king now ventures towards the center, seeking an active role in the unfolding endgame. A brave but potentially risky gambit given the open nature of the board. Unleashing a surprising discovered attack. White's rook drives the opposing king from its protective pawn shield, opening pathways for a more aggressive endgame. The black king, now exposed after the exchange of queens, must prioritize safety, immediately seeking refuge on a more sheltered square. Seizing control of the open file here, White aims to activate the rook aggressively and exploit the exposed black king. The rook's sacrifice on f4 seizes control of the crucial open file, initiating a strategic maneuver aimed at disrupting White's pawn structure and opening lines towards the king. With the rook now eliminated and White's bishop poised to re-enter the fray, this maneuver aims to solidify central control and exploit Black's exposed king, promising a simplified yet advantageous position. A fundamental pawn push, aiming to unlock the dark-squared bishop and establish a foothold in the center. The pawn push on the queenside aims to create queenside space and potentially restrict Black's bishop mobility, though it does open a path for Black's passed d-pawn to become a formidable force if not handled carefully. Securing the central light squares with the bishop aims to disrupt White's pawn structure and potentially open lines for a counter-offensive, while simultaneously offering a trade that simplifies the position favorably if White accepts. Navigating the queenside pawns now becomes a priority as the king seeks safety. Exploiting the open diagonal, Black drives forward, aiming to seize central space and disrupt White's currently rather passive pawn structure. The pawn structure is incredibly fractured now. White's priority must be to solidify the e4 square and prevent Black's centralizing bishop from becoming a menace. The king ventures into the fray, initiating the process of centralizing its authority to support the remaining pieces and prepare for a more active endgame role. Navigating the newly opened central files demands careful king positioning, and shifting the monarch to this square aims to secure a vital diagonal, shielding the pawn chain and preparing for potential pawn breakthroughs while keeping an eye on the vulnerable black king. Transitioning the bishop to this square presents a curious positional choice, potentially offering a temporary outpost while simultaneously sacrificing the initiative for a passive defense. Opening up the bishop to a dynamic diagonal, this move aims to exploit the exposed black king and the newly created space for White's pieces. Pivoting the pawn to occupy the vital e4 square immediately ignites a fierce struggle for central dominance, daring the opponent to either push forward and risk exposure or retreat and cede valuable initiative. Unlocking the c-file presents a sharp tactical opportunity, potentially creating passed pawns and forcing Black's king into a precarious central position. Opening the center with this pawn thrust is a bold attempt to create dynamic play, aiming to unbalance the position and exploit any potential weaknesses in White's pawn structure. Opening the queenside flank with that pawn push dramatically alters the battlefield, forcing a decisive confrontation over control of the now exposed queenside pawns and potentially creating opportunities for your remaining pieces to penetrate. The pawn chain now advances, creating a new, albeit temporary, barrier that White must carefully navigate. Unleashing the queenside pawns creates a decisive structural imbalance, aiming to disrupt Black's pawn chain and generate unstoppable passed threats. Unleashing the king's potential becomes paramount as the queens are gone, forcing a shift in the strategic landscape and demanding active participation from the monarch to support its pawn's advance. Unlocking the diagonal for the bishop allows for potential future pressure along the a4-e8 diagonal, while simultaneously clearing the bishop's retreat square on d2 should the knight on e4 advance. Sacrificing the bishop on g5 opens up diagonals and potentially creates passed pawns. But it also exposes the king more severely to the remaining white pieces. Seizing the initiative. This check forces the black king into a less protected square, disrupting any immediate plans of counterplay and consolidating white's advantage. The monarch, seeking refuge from the encroaching pawns and bishop, attempts to consolidate on the queenside, a necessary but perhaps insufficient endeavor given the exposed nature of its position. Asserting dominance on the d-file. The white king marches forward to actively participate in the pawn race, aiming to escort its remaining soldiers to promotion. The pawn push to d3 injects vital energy into black's beleaguered position, aiming to disrupt white's queenside space and force concrete decisions regarding the d-pawn's fate. Unleashing a decisive pawn thrust. White seizes the initiative and aims to penetrate black's defense, forcing a difficult decision for the opponent's king. Embracing the chaos on the queenside, black steers the king into a pocket of potential space, seeking shelter and a future pawn push. Opening the king's escape route after a daring pawn push. This maneuver aims to exploit the diagonal's weakness and potentially activate the queen's bishop, opening up the bishop to the kingside effectively. The intention here is to activate the defender of the king and prepare for a potential pawn push on the adjacent file, creating counterplay. Unleashing the pawn's potential. This aggressive advance aims to outflank the enemy king and simplify the board by forcing exchanges, potentially leading to a passed pawn breakthrough. Sacrificing the pawn is a calculated risk. The hope is to force the enemy monarch out of its protective shell and create attacking chances on the open queenside.